Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luis Nieves Ruiz, and I will be serving today as your host for this, the second one of our webinar series, Portals of Innovation. This is an opportunity to actually share some insights into various projects that we're working here on behalf of our Eastern Florida region. Before we start, I would like to thank the Orlando Metro section of APA Florida. Our recording of today's webinars will be published on the ECFRPC YouTube channel. You can follow us on youtube.com/eCentralFlorida. Before we begin today's presentation, I would like to give you some information about the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. We were founded in 1962 and are one of 10 similar organizations located through the state of Florida. Our mission is to provide technical assistance to local governments and organizations located within our 8-county region. Our areas of expertise are multiple, and they include community planning, economic development, emergency management, and resilience, among others. So I have the pleasure today of introducing today's speakers. First of all, we have Jennifer Rupert, who's our Resiliency Officer. Jennifer is a strategic leader with a proven record of delivering innovative solutions and driving measurable results to tackle complex challenges. She is the founder of the East Central Florida Regional Resilience Collaborative and has led the development of key initiatives, including the Strategic Resiliency Action Plan, the region's first greenhouse gas inventory, and the forthcoming Regional Integrated Climate Action Plan, United Climate-Informed Conservation Strategies with reductions and freaks and emissions. Today, we're also going by Adrian Santiago Tate. Adrian is the CEO and co-founder of High Tide Intelligence, a flood risk data company on a mission to accelerate flood adaptation with data-driven technology. He holds degrees from Virginia Tech and Stanford, where he published research on PNAS and Earth's future and led the technical development of the award-winning Stanford Urban Risk Framework. At High Tide, Adrian launched Arcly.com, now serving millions of residents employed in Puerto Rico. He has led risk assessments for over a dozen Florida communities, including an 8-county regional project for the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, and automating the vulnerability assessments to streamline resilient Florida compliance. High Tide is now expanding across the Caribbean and Latin America. So I'll let you, Jennifer, start.
Thanks, Luis. I appreciate that very much. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming. Just to review some of the things that we're going to be speaking about today, we're going to talk about resilience overall and how the R2C was established. Go over kind of late groundwork for how we got to where we are today. Speak about the risk assessment itself, of course, how we are applying the data and all of the indicators that we came to move the risk assessment forward. Talk about that application. Consider the economies of risk and what our CRS cohort work occurred, and then go into open discussion and then adjourn the meeting. So in 2017, Hurricane Irma, which is not pictured here, there we go, and 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria impacted East Central Florida. The Planning Council Board had been meeting over several months discussing the various shocks and stressors that they were responding to because of these two storms being in close proximity, only 2 weeks apart. I think as many people recall, Irma came through in September. Maria really struck the Puerto Rico very significantly, and we had a lot of in-migration from that. So those various shocks and stressors we were talking about, or the board was talking about at that time, were affordable housing, that migration, aging infrastructure failures, flooding, sea level rise, just to name a few examples. In each response that they were speaking about within the council board forum, really was a discussion on how discussion and demonstration, if you will, of how organized local leadership can elevate the distinctive assets of a place in ways that really transcend the confines of the past, and hopefully and appropriately building linkages throughout the region, state, and global economy. They were all responding to similar issues, as you see down here. This is Sumter, Seminole County, and then Osceola County in the center. Around the same time as those discussions were happening within our Planning Council board, the August issue, which was in 2018 of Governing Magazine, started really taking a hard look across the country at flooding and building in floodplains. It actually went a step further and opined that officials were starting to embrace the idea to collaborate more closely, as the study that really reviewed South Carolina's flooding identified uncoordinated planning decisions by multiple jurisdictions as one of the most significant factors hindering the overall integrity of the watershed. So when rivers crest and flooding occurs, whether it's in Sumter, Osceola, or Seminole County, our board found common ground and really came up with some solutions. But building resilience at a regional scale, it had to include a mechanism to bring all the stakeholders to the table and engage agencies, elected staff, and the public across multiple jurisdictions. So we pulled together a group of experts across the region through multiple different disciplines. We had emergency management, we had economic development, we had natural resources, affordable housing experts, and the like, all came into a room and really started defining, what does resilience mean from your lens? This term at that time, resilience was really focused, the coastal hazard from DEP, the coastal response was really focused all around just our proper coastal communities, and inland communities were not included in Resilient Florida, had come out shortly thereafter to incorporate our inland communities. So resilience, as this group defined it, was the ability to bounce forward, absorb, recover, and get better in the face of short-term shocks like hurricanes and infrastructure failures, and long-term stressors like affordable housing, aging infrastructure, shifting economic trends, and climate change. That group really pulled together and defined what the vision was going to be for this new mechanism that we were creating, and established as the Ensure a Thriving and Resilient Future through Comprehensive Regional Collaboration. Oops, pardon me. Their next task at hand was figuring out how to make this a reality. What does the structure and framework look like? So under this resilience umbrella, that group decided we were going to work through people, places, and prosperity. People be really the health and equity, places, our built infrastructure and our natural environment, and prosperity, our economic resilience. Each of those, our elected leaders wanted, and they were adamant about incorporating reducing risk and vulnerability, as well as our carbon footprint, and increasing our sustainability goals. They wanted those to be in each one of those pillars. And these pillars already had aligned with a lot of work that was happening across the region. We didn't have to recreate the wheel. It is the same very structure or framework, that we utilize within our comprehensive economic development strategy, with sustainability action plans that were being developed at that time across the region. So we were able to capitalize on that and use the framework as well for this work. Those additional conversations, we really needed to decide, was doing business as usual enough? Was doing just the mainstream, confronting those shocks and stressors, responding to them, was that enough? Do we manage those risks as they were coming down the pipeline? Or do we really need to go a step further and build those adaptive capacities with more robust and integrated processes across the different disciplines that each of us have within our particular local governments? Could we address the real drivers of vulnerability that we have in our region? And the group was essentially unanimous in deciding we really needed to lean in. We need to do both, but really lean in and figure out how we address those drivers of vulnerability while we are going to still have to confront those shocks and stressors as they were coming down the pipeline, if you will. So I want to just kind of engage you all in this moment. You can use either this QR code or join at menti.com and vote. There's a series of, I think, 4 quick questions. The first one being, as I did with that group, what are the vulnerabilities in the systems that you work within? So if you're in a planning department or if you're in a department within a local government, that just has a different lens applied. If you're working with people, what kind of vulnerabilities do they experience? Is it affordable housing? Is it structures? Is it, do you represent local businesses? What are their vulnerabilities? So if you could go ahead and fill those in. And those should start popping up as people respond. Whoop. Yeah, water supply for sure. Drainage, absolutely. Well, as you're thinking about those and understanding the vulnerabilities, drainage, sewer systems, so on and so forth, aging infrastructure, exactly. This, the group that we were pulling together also identified some of the same issues. And what we really came to, they included housing, education, training, broadband access, transportation, safe open spaces, physical activity, housing again, healthcare access, access to energy and clean water, all of those things kind of coming together. In each one of those groups that we pulled together within these particular committees, whether they were focused on CBOs and very people-focused type of committee, or our place-based committee, which incorporated, really infrastructure from a natural resources, blue and green perspective, or a gray perspective from transportation folks, or if it was our local businesses, they each were saying some of the same things, just as you all were starting to add in some of those gray infrastructure source systems and the like. We named those our drivers of vulnerability in the region and really started to define what those indicators were. And this becomes important as a jumping or launch pad for all the rest of the works that we are moving forward. So we established a risk and vulnerability committee, as that is in our very framework. We want to reduce risk and vulnerability. We established a group which essentially defined who and what they were doing. It was all of our emergency management directors across the region. So not only from our counties and some of our cities, but from our universities, from our hospital systems. And they really defined and established goals saying we want to develop a regional scale risk assessment. We want to make sure it accounts for those social vulnerabilities. It incorporates climate sensitivities and the future conditions that we know are coming upon us. They wanted to understand what regional scale mitigation would look like and figure out what land use solutions we could utilize or what tools were available to mitigate some of those problems. All of this work, those drivers of vulnerability, all the different committee work defining themselves and establishing goals went into the strategic regional policy plan, really laid the groundwork for everything that the collaborative was going to move and step forward. Today, we're about 44 partners. This is a handful of them on the screen, and we still continue to meet. The steering committee essentially meets quarterly and as needed. We have a council subcommittee and several other groups that meet to discuss the issues as they're coming together. The collaborative role really is to do four things. It's to focus on areas of substantive strategic concern, to build capacity and capability, and leverage expertise and resources all throughout this region and globally, quite honestly. We develop pathways to funding and investment, even sometimes utilizing unique partnerships. But really, it's to take an idea that might be had through a committee or through a committee member, figure out how to operationalize that, not only within our structures within the Regional Planning Council, but through and into our local governments that we represent through our partners, and then pull in investment or capital to we can figure out how to operationalize a lot of this stuff and bring capital in the region to do that. So when you start thinking about risk and how local governments tackle risk in the area, this really was the first snapshot that we were able to take of what kind of mitigation is happening within all of our local governments across the region. So we asked them for what their local mitigation strategy had on their plans in the 2017 timeframe. You see most of those focus really around fire, flooding, severe weather, some utility lines. And you can see on the dots on the screen everything that they were tackling at that time. Clearly, local mitigation strategies aren't the only way that local governments do mitigation. There's CIP plans and other mitigation that happens, but these were the ones that we could address as we were working with our emergency management directors. So this happens statewide. Hazard identification and risk assessment occurs. Mitigation goals and actions are established. There's coordination and collaboration that happens within each county and all of its cities. And the regular updates are occurring with these, and they do a lot of engagement to come to these meetings. And what we really found was over time, the mitigation that was happening might not necessarily meet some of the larger risks that we were finding throughout the region. So we established a project to really understand and develop a risk assessment across the region and have been working on it since about, I think 2020 was when we started this work. We started being recognized for it in 2023 and 2024 as well. And risk as we are defining it in this new, really robust way is the threat times vulnerability times the severity of consequence. Thinking about the drivers of vulnerability and the way we've defined them, we were able to incorporate 33 different indicators, and that became the vulnerability section of this spatial mapping. And severity of consequences really dove into climate sensitivities or incorporated climate sensitivities, historical scores, the severity or frequency of the threat that as it's being showed here. And it also incorporated for the first time across the region the Department of Health data that started looking at or taking into account for the first time heat stress to cause to a body, heat strokes, diabetes, different types of indicators. So we expanded that version in this. So risk is a function of the hazard occurrence, vulnerable people, and the lifelines, and high enough severity of consequence that impacts to lives and livelihoods may be realized. Places where high hazards, vulnerability, or severity of consequences are low will result obviously in lower risk. With this update that we have just completed, we now have 20 hazard types that are incorporated, so it goes beyond flooding. There are 33 social vulnerability indicators or drivers of vulnerability. And then the severity of consequences, I already mentioned, includes climate sensitivities, as well as other data sets from the Department of Health that illustrate impacts to people like heat stroke. Why does this all matter? We are really trying to flip the way we think about risk on its head, or how we, I guess, respond to risk on its head. Instead of having an impact occur, recognizing where we need to respond and mitigate or offer some solutions and funding particular projects, we're really saying, let's try to empirically drive this through a data-driven decision-making process and do it in a way that incorporates all of these data standards and spatially maps it, so we can discuss those. We worked with UCF and Dr. Chris Emmerich on this, and he is going to walk you through two different kind of examples of how to utilize this data in the next slide. So I will pause.
Hello, this is Chris Emmerich. I have been working with the R2C group for several years, and I'm excited to share some of our outputs with you to help you better understand the utility of the risk assessment methods we have put in place and are now automating for our counties. First, know that hazardrisk.org is built to support planning and decision-making by boiling down complex processes and data sets into manageable analytics and visuals. In this example, I wanted to quickly show you how we can easily identify the areas of any county. Here we're using orange, to figure out the most at risk from both riverine flooding and flash flooding caused by extensive rainfall, both very real possibilities we have experienced recently. Using the built-in filtering tool, anyone can easily select a risk level. Here we're using 25 for each hazard. This shows us the places where these hazards are likely to happen in the future. We can further refine our analysis to focus on areas with more vulnerable populations, more overall populations, and higher amounts of community lifelines. The resulting areas would be candidates for projects aimed at flood mitigation in areas with more people, things, and the highest overall vulnerability. I called that a win-win-win. In this example, we will take a closer look at Lake County and use the tool to ascertain the areas best suited for construction of a cooling center aimed at building community resilience in the face of extreme heat events. Here we have pre-selected Lake County and first take a look at any place greater than 50% heat risk. The result shows us that nearly the whole county is at elevated heat risk. Bumping that up to 75 gives us a more accurate picture of where in the county we have higher heat risk. Note that beyond county, we can use hazardrisk.org to drill down to individual cities. Like the previous example, we also want to know which of these places has high population and more vulnerable populations. But here we want to put this new cooling center in a place that has fewer community lifelines and could benefit from additional infrastructure investments. With all of our filters in place, one can easily see two areas where community cooling centers would be most impactful in supporting community resilience. A bigger area near Mineola and Claremont, and several other areas near Leesburg and Lady Lake that fit our criteria. With all of these hazards data at our fingertips, the number of questions we can answer about threats, vulnerabilities, risk, and mitigation are limitless, and the progress we can make toward building community resilience is endless.
In addition to the two examples Chris just spoke to, we also had to figure out how we were applying some of this data that we utilized throughout the risk assessment into vulnerability assessments. As Resilient Florida came online, vulnerability assessments were happening across the region. And we were working to figure out taking that SOVI data or the social vulnerability data, those regional drivers of vulnerability, which have now become one and the same, look at population, flooding, and natural resources in a new way. And we did that through statute and the vulnerability assessments through the sensitivity areas, and that incorporated future sensitivities. This is one of the early maps that we started working on and incorporated as we were working with particular jurisdictions on their vulnerability assessments. They were able to utilize these data sets, and we incorporated it into those vulnerability assessments. Fast forward, again, this is, I think, where we're at this current cycle. We really wanted to try to figure out, now that that risk assessment is complete, emergency management directors began to have access to those data sets, really starting to recognize, as an example, heat as a hazard, to use Chris's example, heat as a hazard in Seminole County went from like number 9 on their list of hazards up to a number 2 because of the way that all of the data was crunching together. So we needed to figure out a way, how do we automate all of this data that we have, so year over year it becomes usable and to all of the emergency managers, and how do we integrate concurrent programs that were happening across the region. We, at the time, or really concurrently, we were, the Regional Planning Council was working on an extreme rainfall project, working with several other regional planning councils and the Flood Hub to recognize or to come around to build consensus around parameters in the region to utilize this extreme rainfall model. So we have integrated the outputs of that rainfall modeling into the risk assessment, expanded the hazards that we were incorporating, and then we wanted to figure out further how we can utilize and apply all of this data and conduct some analysis. So within that application, you see here, we were updating in the background all of those analytics, the hazards. We had completed the update to now have 20 completed. Extreme rainfall in 2040 and 2070 were incorporated. We looked at land subsidence, and then sinkholes, that sinkhole data needed to be revised. Vulnerabilities within the social vulnerability space, populations, community lifelines, those were all updated as well, as in addition to the severity of a consequence. And that really made up new risk maps, composite maps for the region. The site we've worked to build and are about to unveil in the next few days by the end of this month is called Vulnerability Mapping Analysis Platform, or VMAP. You will have the capability to go into this tool. The site is live now. This particular section of the site is not. And hit reporting tools as is outlined there and write your own risk assessment. And that's a risk assessment, a HIRA, a THIRA, which is, all of these are required plans by emergency management directors, and they designed it. Within that planning tool, they will be able to select and customize exactly the type of document that they're looking for. This example here is selected for the state of Florida. You can get it at the county or city scale. We've selected THIRA here. The last plan submission is 2020. The next plan due date is in 2026, and that's 2025, because those are generally due, I believe, every 5 years. You can select the threats of interest, vulnerabilities, and then customize the severity of the consequences. And it's essentially will spit you out charts, maps, graphs, and 50 to 60 page documents. Some of them are a little bit longer, that collates all of the data and prepares it for these plans that, quite frankly, take a lot of time to put together, as a comprehensive plan does, as all of the plans that are required by local governments do. So it also looks back and looks at historical consequences to offer differences in trends that you might see. You can really take a look. I'll toggle, for a moment back and forth between these two. This time frame between 1960 and 2023, you can look at all the scores and the historic scores, and then jump into just this decade, 2020 to 2023. And it continues to do that throughout, and then comes to a composite score with an additional severity of consequences. This report that I mentioned is, this is what it actually looks like. You'll see the planning report was prepared by me this morning. I stuck with Osceola County. It takes roughly 2 to 5 minutes, quite honestly, depending on the level of activity that will be on the website. We're hoping to have this go across the state of Florida, but for now, this region will be able to tap in and utilize this as a free resource. Our board has adopted this as part and parcel of what we are delivering to our counties. The specific data and images generated, this is part of it. You selected the state, you see how it's all starting to come together based on what you've put into that, and it spits you out the maps, average annual flash flood warnings. These are just a few examples that I pulled out for you all to look at. What the social vulnerabilities are really starting to show us, where they have, high vulnerabilities there. And then we needed to say, okay, well, this is all great. Emergency management directors are essentially set up. They can get these documents for quite some time. That'll be available to them. But what does that mean into the planning profession, and how can we potentially utilize it? So we really started to work with the data and look at doing analysis. And this is where we've been the last 3 months, quite honestly. with the areas that have the highest composite risk, we wanted to understand, look at those areas across the region, understand what's driving that risk, and then look at what work is underway. So this is some of the methodology that we use. So in this composite map that's in the top right-hand corner of your screen, we really analyzed where some of those high-risk areas are. If you look on your screen here, you know, the darker red is Orange County, Daytona Beach area. These are all the areas where there are high risk. So what does that look like? Understand what is the hazard risk, what kind of vulnerabilities are located of those 33 indicators, what's really driving it, and then with the infrastructure, understand what kind of critical assets are there, and that really starts pulling on some of the vulnerability assessments that are located. And then take that next step to align with or understand from local mitigation strategies, again, what's actually already occurring, what are the counties already responding to in those areas, and what can we build from as a region. So we started to define what project areas or what kind of regional scale project areas that we wanted to look at. So we queried essentially composite risk scores greater or equal to 4, so that would be 4 and 5, integrated that extreme rainfall data from or modeling results from our other project that we were running concurrently in the Regional Planning Council, and then looked cross-jurisdictionally. Counties and cities, as I mentioned, are already coordinate on the type of mitigation they are doing. So we really wanted to look across jurisdictions on what we could do collaboratively. And we had taken the liberty, if you will, of selecting 3 areas to focus on for today. But these are really, I think there's 17 or 18 different areas in this map that we've identified, looking at high temperatures, looking at hurricane winds, and then different kinds of flooding that was happening. And so I'll show you some of the data that's come out or that we have the capability to pull from. In that first area, or I guess in these 3 areas, we always can compare it to the regional number. So the hazards, the top 5 hazards in each one of these areas you see are kind of spread across this screen. You have hurricane winds for the region, high temperatures, and really flooding. Extreme rainfall, flooding, and flash flooding are the next 3. So it really rounds out, those are the top 3 hazards that we need to be concerned about across the region. For the Four Corners area, which is down in this area, high temperatures, 100-year flooding, extreme rainfall, again, lots of flooding examples down there. Sanford to Lake Mary, which is this section right in here, hurricanes, high temperatures, severe storms, each one of these having a little bit different labels. And then in this area, Palm Bay to Melbourne is really flash flooding, extreme rainfall, and severe storms, rounding out those hazard categories. Then we dive into, okay, with that understanding that now that we know what those high hazards are, we understand what's been impacting those areas, what kind of infrastructure is there, what might we as local governments need to strengthen or harden, and then what else can we do creatively to mitigate some of those impacts that we know are continuously happen over there. If we just focus on that Sanford to Lake Mary space, total critical asset counts, and then this is pulling from that FDEP vulnerability assessment data that the state has available, not FEMA's flood set. 149 different critical assets are located in that Sanford to Lake Mary area. 21,700 for the region. Regionally significant, there's none in that space. Regionally significant are hospitals or something of the like that we know are being utilized by more than just one particular area. How much of the area is in conservation? So you can really think about utilizing the lands for flood mitigation. Only 3% in this area, or 216 acres. Percentage of wetland coverage, 17%, so on and so forth. Impervious surfaces, 33%. Public roadways, 288 miles, and number of structures. From there, we can start looking at understanding the critical assets are there, what we might need to harden on the surface, the kinds of things we might need to do, thinking about conservation or mitigation. And then we start really thinking about, well, I think that's all that is fine and good, but who are the people that actually live there? And when we respond into these areas in particular, what kinds of resources might we need to send into those areas if we are responding, but hopefully having the capability to do it in blue skies? What kind of programs do we need to establish? So we can see, again, focusing in that Sanford to Lake area, Lake Mary location, the scores are averaged. Sanford to Lake Mary has a 3, so lower social vulnerability score. 82,000 people are located there, 34,500 housing units, and so on and so forth. What I found interesting, and I kind of highlighted here, they have a very high percentage of renters in that area as compared to the rest of the region, 20%, 7% in the region that have a high percentage of the percentage of renters, 37% in Sanford to Lake Mary. The percent of households spending more than 30% of their income on housing, 35% versus 32 in this area. Continuing on with that, what race might live there, 19% of Black population, 19% Asian population. Compared to the region, it is a little bit higher. The average per capita income is just a little bit lower than at the regional scale. So when you start taking these things into account, the percent of kids in single parent families, 38% in the region, it jumps up to 47% in that Sanford to Lake Mary's place. No health insurance, a little bit higher than the region. Female head of households, 17%. Households with no vehicles, 6.9% versus 0.05 across the region. So you can start thinking about what kind of resources do we need to deploy in an equitable way across the region. And by equity, I just want to clarify, I mean, if we all were in a car accident, but I'm only handing out Band-Aids to everybody, it's not going to do justice to myself. Yes, it would work if I had a cut on my hand, to the person that was in the passenger seat that might have had a greater cut or a head injury. The Band-Aid's not going to cut it. So we want to get the right resources to the right areas at the right times. So I think this data starts allowing us to think about the type of people that are in this area that we might need to deploy different kinds of resources to. And then we needed, from understanding what some of those areas illustrate, still looking at that Sanford to Lake Mary priority project area, what is already happening, what kind of mitigation projects have already happened. So you see here, there's a slew of flooding projects, already happening in the area that we could potentially build from and deploy, think about additional resources to. This was another area, Altamont Springs to Eatonville, and this is really essentially just to show you all the different types of mitigation projects that we did capture, and then thinking again about and illustrating the different county metrics that we incorporated compared to cities, and then again with the project areas. So you can select different areas, select different cities, understand its place within the county, and then the place within the entire region. So applicable and usable across a number of platforms. This is just where we are today with this. The long and short of it is another applied way we're going to be using this. While we've been running this concurrent risk assessment project, our plan is to utilize it, or develop a regional mitigation strategy, and to join it into our integrated climate action plan that we're in the process of writing throughout the region. So we'll have the climate action plan with the proper emissions reducing activities across a number of different categories, if you will, joined together with our regional mitigation strategy, and then also together with a climate-informed conservation strategy that we've been conducting in just about now 6 of our 8 counties across the region. I want to pivot now and think about, so yep, we have the hazardrisk.org where all of our emergency management directors can understand what risk is happening across the region. We've developed that regional list of mitigation, not project, but project areas, if you will, really emphasizing the alignment and the interactions of the strategies. But then we needed to get to well, so what does that mean to our residents that actually live here? And we partnered concurrently and did some work with Arkley and High Tide and started thinking about how can we get to residents and start communicating to residents in a new way what their risk is and what the risk means to them and to our local government's bottom line. And how can we start decoupling that in a new way across the region. And then we hope to get to a point where we can explore insurance and parametric partnerships. Back in 2020 to 2021 to start thinking about buildings as these new spaces, bringing it down to the residents' perspective. The Planning Council had worked with the University of Florida on really starting with where are homes located? What is the stock of housing all across the region? 1.2 million residential properties overall across our region. Less than 15% of it at that time is affordable housing, or what we were calling affordable housing, and that's defined really by the naturally occurring affordable housing, the subsidized housing, and then mobile homes, parks, and parcels. 182,700 of units we have are affordable housing properties out of, like I said, the 1.2 million. Of those subsidized units, 18.3% of those, with that large map on the left, are built and exposed to inland flooding. That's using the FEMA flood maps. One of them is in the floodway. If you move to the naturally occurring affordable housing, which is really, I think, what some people label as attainable, 23% of those are already, we know today, as of 2020, they were in the floodplain or exposed to inland flooding. That's a 100-year or 500-year flooding. 494 of those are in the floodway. Of mobile homes, parks, and parcels, 27% of those were also exposed to inland flooding, and 192 in the floodway. So going back to that, 2018 governing magazine, we continuously are allowing building to happen in risky areas. And how can we really start thinking about this in a new way and working with residents to get them to think differently what they can do on their properties? And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Adrian of Santiago Tate of High Tide. Luis already introduced him earlier, so I'd like to hand it over. Adrian?
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get started. So my name's Adrian Santiago Tate, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of High Tide Intelligence. We've been working with the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council for years, and this is one of my favorite projects that we've done, the Regional Impact Assessment. So here's kind of the highlights or the main takeaways from the analysis that we did. So overall, in this region, we found $10.3 billion of flood risk from the 1% annual exceedance probability event, or the 100-year storm, as we regularly refer to it. And of that, 73% is uninsured, at least uninsured by the NFIP. So what that means is $7.5 billion of risk that are a burden to homeowners, potential burden to homeowners, and consequently their communities. Here on the right, we see the results of Chris's modeling. So the two are similar but different, and we focus more at High Tide on quantifying the impacts in terms of the economic impact, so in dollars like you see here, but also the socioeconomic impact. So how many households could be displaced based on their income, and then also what their risk is. So let's go to the next slide. So just to kind of give you a quick understanding of the technology, I started High Tide after getting involved in this interdisciplinary research initiative at Stanford University, where we wanted to understand what the potential impacts could be to the San Francisco Bay at the time. And we tried using some of the existing tools, but they were very limiting. So tools like HAZs exist and are used frequently to quantify flood risk in dollars to buildings, but we wanted to take it further and get to that part where we're saying, going beyond an index, we actually want to get metrics that tell us how many people could be displaced by flooding and, if you're a high income individual, even if you have high flood risk, it may not have a big impact on you, and it may not displace you from your home if there's a big flood, especially if you have flood insurance. But if you're lower to medium income and you're in a high risk area, then that can be very devastating. So we just wanted to figure out where those people are that really need that help or that attention and that raising of awareness. So that's why that was the motivation for developing what became the Stanford Urban Risk Framework, which if you would like to learn all the technical details, there's the link here for the publication. But basically it's, taking your exposed assets, whatever they are, your hazard layer, which we mostly focus on flooding, and then the vulnerability and intersecting that to figure out what is the damage in dollars, and then looking at the census data, which gives us a distribution of people's income within any given block group, and figuring out in a complicated way because this data is not available. We don't have data on what is the income of each household in each building, but we do have a good idea of what the distribution of the income is in a block group. So we can use Monte Carlo simulations to basically randomly place these people and then get a distribution of the number of households at risk. So that works pretty well. And that's basically what's under the hood of what we do at High Tide. And then on the forward-facing side, some of you might already be aware of Arkley, our platform, which is a flood risk management platform for the public. And it's available in Florida. It's publicly available. Any of you can go on there and look up your flood risk. So there's surf under the hood, and then Arkley is how we get this data out there. So that's just a little overview of kind of our technology. And for the regional risk assessment, the extreme rainfall flood models that Jennifer mentioned that are now complete, not ready at the time. So we had to rely on FEMA flood zones to have a uniform um, a uniform methodology throughout the region. In the coastal counties, in Volusia and Brevard, we also did sea level rise and storm surge modeling, so we have a lot more information there. But to have something uniform that we can compare across the region, we used the FEMA flood zones and quantified the damage to properties in those buildings, and then also looked at the potential displacement as well as the potential property tax impact. So let's go on. So this is kind of just an excerpt from the report that we provided for one of the counties. And I'm not going to read this whole thing out, but the main concept, I guess, the way that we think about flood risk at high tide is pretty different from how it's normally approached. So for a long time, we've approached flooding as something that we need to control, right? Like it's humans versus nature, and we need to stop the flooding from happening. And I grew up in the Netherlands, which is kind of, they're the masters of this art. They have hundreds of years of history of managing nature and controlling flooding, and have done a really good job in their country. But there's numerous reasons why that approach is very difficult to replicate in other places, and especially in the US, where we have a very individualistic society and a strong focus on property ownership. You really have to look at the problem more in terms of what an individual can do. So as sea level rise, the sea continues to rise, as storms become more extreme because the ocean's hotter, we see more extreme rainfall every year. It's going to get harder and harder and harder to stop the flooding from happening. So we have to turn the problem on its head. The problem isn't the flooding itself. The problem is that we have all of these assets, all of these buildings, all of these people that are in places that will flood. So what can we do to manage the impacts so that when a flood does occur, it's not actually a problem, right? So it's all about when I look out the window and I think about flood risk, it's really the buildings that are the issue. There's all these buildings that were built before flood management was a thing, before there were building codes and flood zones. And still buildings that are being built today in known flood zones with not very stringent requirements, right? So if we built differently, we wouldn't have such a problem. But we do. The reality is there are millions of homeowners in Florida that have flood risk, and they have a limited set of options. So from a risk management standpoint, you've got avoid, transfer, mitigate, and assume. So assuming risk is what the majority of people are doing either knowingly or not knowingly, and they'll take the financial hit if their house floods. Avoiding the risk would be basically selling your property, which is not what we're going for. We don't want people to be displaced from their homes and their communities. Transferring the risk is buying an insurance policy. So you're paying an insurance company to sign a contract with you that says exactly what will happen if you are flooded. And most people don't read their policies, but they should, because that they're paying for an agreement. And there's a lot of surprises that people kind of run into. And mitigate is really what we are striving for long term, right? We want to mitigate the flooding. We want to reduce the risk so that we don't have all these communities displaced. And in the long term, with sea level rise, there are places where mitigation no longer will work, but that's still down the road, and there's still plenty of time for these communities to thrive and get ahead of this problem. So that's kind of the overview, but if you put yourself in the shoes of a property owner that has flood risk, these are your options, and it's already hurricane season, so mitigation is going to be tough. There's a few products that you can go out and buy that definitely help. But the main first line of defense is flood insurance. So we were very focused on insurance during this project, and we did some estimation to see, based on the NFIP data and the number of buildings that were in the floodplain, how many buildings were insured. And I believe the state average is 22%. And we saw a very broad range of these numbers throughout the region. In some counties, it was as low as single figures, while in others, it was above 60% that had flood insurance. There was one county that was incredible. It had more flood insurance policies than it had buildings in the floodplain. So that county's done a very good job. But the thing that stuck out to me the most was whenever we went to the communities and presented this data, we said, hey, here's how many buildings you have in the floodplain. Does that sound about right? Yeah, that sounds about right. Here's how many insurance policies we think there are. Is that about right? Okay, so why is it so low, or why is it so high? What is it that you're doing to get to these numbers? And there was a kind of, I observed a correlation between how much the communities said, how active they said they were in terms of raising awareness of flood risk and raising awareness of flood insurance. And many of them were doing this through the community rating system. So the ones that were very active at this appeared to have much higher percentages of flood insurance uptake. So this to us was kind of an idea for the project that followed immediately after. So looking at this example, actually, yeah, let's keep going. So we decided that our next step would be to create a set of tools that would help communities in the region and beyond to leverage all the data that we had produced in order to raise awareness of flood risk and flood insurance, and to kind of facilitate that, make it easier. And we wanted to do this within the framework of the community rating system because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There's a kind of a gold standard with the CRS for how floodplain management should be approached, and we wanted to leverage that. So our goal with this project was to help to increase flood insurance uptake, improve resilience, help to build that front line of defense against flooding, and to provide this toolkit. So I saw that in the chat that there were some CFMs here, so I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the community rating system. But something I've observed through my work is that there's kind of a disconnect between the planners, who are often working on vulnerability assessments, and the floodplain managers who are working on floodplain management. They don't seem to talk to each other very much, so we kind of wanted to help to bridge that gap and bring the two together. But for those of you that don't know what the CRS is, it's a program that's under FEMA. So FEMA is kind of the three-legged stool is flood mapping, the NFIP, so the flood insurance, and then the community rating system, which is all about managing development in the floodplain, and it's incentivized. So the carrot for participating in the community rating system is the NFIP discounts that policyholders in that community will get. So the carrot is great. The carrot is the reason people get excited about the community rating system. It's like gamified. So the more activities you do and the more points you collect, you go up a class, you get an insurance discount, discount. You can demonstrate immediate value to your community in terms of insurance savings, which justify the investments and the cost that goes into maintaining and running this program. But the insurance discounts are not the end all be all. I mean, pretty much everything in the community rating system is a fantastic thing to do and should be done, regardless of these discounts. And I think that's important to state as we kind of look at the interesting climate, so to speak, ahead of us with what's going on with FEMA. So if the community rating system ceased to exist, I still think that the manual is great and these things should be done. And, you know, maybe more easy to do because there'll be less documentation to keep up with for compliance. But anyway, it's a voluntary program, and there's a variety of activities that you can do. Some of them are as simple as just raising awareness and giving out flyers, and others are as involved as, you know, building flood control systems and having early warning systems and pretty much everything you can think of. And the potential reduction in flood insurance is up to 45% if you're a class 1, which there's usually just 1 or 2 in the country. Pinellas is kind of the poster child of floodplain management in Florida right now with a class 2. So moving on. So, you know, with the limited amount of time that we had for this project, we had to figure out where within the CRS, within all the activities that there are, kind of go through them and see where would we be able to get communities in our region points for doing these activities in a way that makes sense, given that what we're trying to do is leverage this extreme rainfall data and ArcLI, this platform, to communicate that to the public. So where is it kind of easy for us to pick up points doing this, and in a way that we can just hand off a product to the communities and they're able to run with it and get those points. So we looked through all of them, and the one that made the most sense was the first one over here, 322, the 322 activities. So there's a series of them. They're all in the 320s. The map information services. So most communities will have a website where you can look up flood zones and certain information. And the one that made the most sense was the flood depth data, 322D. So if you provide property level estimates of flood depth, then you can get points for that. What we found, however, while looking at the points that communities that were participated in our cohort, they provided us all of their kind of CRS data so we could look at it and figure out where the potential was for the points. We found that most of the communities had already maxed out their 320 points. So you can only get 90. And if you already have 90 and you haven't gotten the 20 for 322D, you can't get 110. It's capped out. So even though we went ahead and we built out the product for 322D, so it's available to everyone, for most of the communities, it didn't generate many points. And even so, it would only have generated 20 points, where there's plenty of other places in the CRS where there's a lot of point potential that communities aren't really leveraging. So the one that we decided made the absolute most sense was the outreach projects, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what this whole project was about, which was just getting the word out about flood risk and flood insurance. So we focused a lot on 332A, the outreach projects, which has a potential of 200 points. And looking at the communities in our cohort, some of them had maxed it out. So like Orange County already had 200 with an additional 93 points, 93.2 points for other work from their public information, the program for public information, which kind of gets you more points for this activity. But quite a few of the communities had a lot of point potential. So we decided to focus there. And what we ended up doing was we built a product that made it easy for communities to basically follow our toolkit and get points for 322A as well as 322D and 332A. So, okay, so for 322D, like I said, we're required to show flood depth data at the property level. And, you know, with the CRS, there's always doing the activity and then documenting the activity. So for documentation, we found that providing a map was sufficient, because the tool that we developed was not, it has a map, but it's not focused on showing a raster map like the one we're showing here. It's more focused on saying, hey, here's what could happen at your house. So on the front end, all the community really has to do is link to to Arcly. So basically say, hey, you can click here and get property level flood depth data. And then with this documentation with the map, we satisfied the requirements. And I'll go to the tool at the very end. And then, so this is what the toolkit looks like. It's a step-by-step of, what you need to do to get these points using the tools that we made available to you. Like I said, you simply have to link to Arcly, but we can also give you the code. It also includes a code so that you can just embed it directly into your community's website. So here's an example from Satellite Beach, where they've actually embedded the map directly on their website. And then on the right here, you can see this tool that we developed to show the flood depths at the property level. So I think that covers everything. So I already mentioned Arcly. It's our publicly available platform. We've launched it in Florida in 2023, and then also in Puerto Rico. So we have over 10 million buildings now. It's available in English and Spanish.
Adrian, I'd love for you to do a demo if you could.
Yeah.
Grab the screen.
Definitely. And how are we doing on time?
You are doing fine. You have a good at least 5 to 7 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, can you see Arcly right now?
I can.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, so my grandfather lives over in Martin County on the St. Lucie River, and that's the place I've been visiting my whole life. And growing up in the Netherlands, which is below sea level, and then visiting my family in Florida, which is very close to sea level, will be in the future below sea level, is what inspired me to get into this. And this particular house is kind of where that happened. So my grandfather's been enjoying his retirement and his view for the past few decades, not worried at all about flooding, sitting deep in a flood zone, very high risk. But so I'll just do a quick walkthrough. So obviously we've got a map. You zoom out, you can see got the whole state, all the way from the state down to the individual buildings. We've got this fun feature on the bottom, the flood risk time machine, where you can go into the future and see what future flood risk looks like. And since there's some naughty words in the state of Florida, we try to keep it pretty agnostic. And then the crux of the matter with flooding is that it is a very expensive problem, right? So that's why it's just so critical that you're able to quantify that problem with dollars, because that's what it really means to people. So, saying you're a 9 out of 10 on risk is relatively helpful. If you're home buying, you may want to buy a 5 out of 10 instead of 9 out of 10. It doesn't really tell you a whole lot if you already own the property. So, we've tried with our economic impact analysis to make it mean something to people in terms of dollars, which is why we show this number here, which we call the flood risk in dollars per year. Engineers and actuaries would call it the average annual loss. But it's still an abstract number. You can think about it as like a self-insurance estimate. So, put $12,000 in your piggy bank, and over the long run, that will cover your flood losses. But this number is especially useful because it's what you can compare directly to the cost of solutions. So if your flood risk is $12,000 a year, an insurance policy starts at $1,100 a year. You could either put $12,000 in your piggy bank and do that every year and hope for the best. And when you get a hit, when there's a loss, you should be able to cover that over the long term. Or you could pay a company $1,100 and they will cover up to $250,000 of losses. So objectively, it's a much better deal. Flood insurance makes a lot of sense when you look at the numbers. The other option, which in the long term makes a lot more sense, is to elevate the home to mitigate the flooding. There's a variety of ways you can mitigate flooding, but elevating is the most appropriate long-term solution for residential properties. And in this case, if you were able to get a 30-year loan, it would cost $16,000 a year to elevate this property. So it's definitely not something my family is considering. However, if we go into the future, let's say 2050, the risk starts to go up. If we go another 20 years, the risk is now blown up completely. $39,000 a year. I mean, nobody's setting aside $12,000 a year, but $39,000, you're in very unsustainable, risky territory. So what we did with this project, before I get into that, the idea here is not just to give people the bad news. The idea is to make it easy for them to make that decision. So like I said earlier, you can assume the risk, you can avoid it, you can transfer it, or you can mitigate it. So we want to put all the options in front of you, each of them with their price tag, and then you can click on them and actually implement that solution, like execute on that decision right away. And as I said earlier, this $12,000 a year is a really helpful number once you wrap your head around it, but it's pretty abstract. So with this project, we decided to just provide a whole lot more data. So in addition to the water levels, we've got individual loss numbers for each event. So here we're showing the base flood elevation, which for a ground elevation of 4 feet and a base flood elevation of 6 feet, you're looking at 2 feet of flood depth, which is estimated to cost $121,000 of damage. We've got some other models here, some other data sets. So you can look at the results of our own coastal flood model, where we're pulling data from both NOAA and FEMA. And this has a lot more granularity. You can look at any point in time and also different events. So for tidal flooding, it looks like 2070, there's still no tidal flooding. 2080, still none. Pretty good. Oh, 2100. So permanently underwater by the end of the century over here. So this is the flood depth data that satisfies that activity 322D, which we have flood depth data for the entire state of Florida on here. So any community in Florida can start to link to this, provide it to their, link it as a resource to their community. And if they provide the documentation during their next ISO, their CRS visit, then they should get those 20 points. And yeah, I think that was 5 minutes. Is there anything else you want me to cover, Jennifer?
No, I love this, the flood risk time machine. Still my favorite part. I just like it a lot. I think that it pretty much, let me share my screen again. I have one more activity that I would like you guys to take a look at. Key takeaways, and then we can get into questions. I'll hand it back to Louise. But ideas with all of this information, especially that you guys, a lot of you are planners. Adrian had mentioned there's a sort of a floodplain manager in the room. What are some things that we can do together? What are ways we can apply the data sets? We can work with, continue to evolve the ARCLY platform to provide our residents the best data available that we have available and have our hands in all day. But when a resident, my mother-in-law as an example, wants to gain an understanding of where her home is and the types of things that she can do, ARCLY is a great place that I can send her to start learning about some of the opportunities that she might be able to do and implement on her property. So what are the key takeaways? Some of you have already responded. Stop building in risky areas. I'll give you a big fat amen on that one. Collaboration, absolutely. Get flood insurance as that first line of defense and work to decouple risk. Elevate unity, collaboration, all good things. With that, Luis, I will hand it back to you. I'm looking forward to defining some next steps with the planning community and seeing what this next year might hold. Thank you, everyone. Luis?
Thank you, Jennifer and Adrian, for providing some important insights into CRS and vulnerability analysis. A reminder to all attendees, you can put your questions on the chat. If you had any, I do have some questions here to break the ice, and this one is for Adrian. Beyond insurance and elevation, what steps will an inlet community take to reduce flooding?
So the question was, other than insurance and elevation?
Yes, beyond insurance and elevation.
beyond insurance and elevation. So I mean, when you're talking about rainfall, the main thing everyone's mind goes to is stormwater infrastructure, right? So having proper drainage, and that's been a focus for a very long time. I think that like half of the funding that is being deployed through Resilient Florida is still going to stormwater infrastructure. So it's obviously a important thing to do. But that's at the community level. It's not, well, I guess within your own home, within your property, there are some things you can do to make sure the water isn't pooling up against your house. So actually a great example from my own house, there was a spot in my driveway, like a low spot, where the water would pool and touch the wall on my house. And, after it rained, there would just be a puddle there. And over the years, that water that was up against the house ended up rotting the entire wall. So that entire wall needed to be replaced just from a puddle. So, we put a French drain in the driveway, and then that solved that problem. So there are things you can do in terms of drainage at a smaller scale that have value. Obviously, at the larger scale is what everyone thinks of. But beyond just, engineering the world, like I was talking about earlier, what you can do for your own property beyond insurance and elevating the property is different degrees of flood proofing. So, for commercial properties, you'll see all kinds of flood proofing solutions that are available. For residential, you don't see that much because residential buildings are typically not built to a standard where flood proofing solutions are appropriate. But there are kind of low cost, you know, formal and less formal versions. So, sandbagging is what people have been doing forever. There are much better versions than sandbagging. So we recently started working with a company called floodproofing.com that has a product called Damn Easy, which is it's a funny pun, but it's basically something it goes in your entryways, so in your doors and door openings and garage doors, and it prevents the water from getting in through the door up to 2.5 feet, so up to 20 inches. So that's a product that, if you have two or three doors, you buy two or three of those, you keep them in the garage, and when you know that there is water coming, that could, mitigate the risk for up to 28 inches, which, most of the time if you're in an area that is flooding regularly, maybe at high tide or during just heavy rainfall events, that level of protection is extremely valuable because we know from FEMA that 1 inch of flooding on average costs $25,000. So you're spending anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 buying these things, but they pay for themselves 10 times over the first time they protect you from a flood, and then every time after that. So that's definitely something that when I go present to communities and I tell them about elevating, there's obviously something that we all think we should do, but who's going to pay for it? So solutions like this are very popular at the moment. And then there's also the deployable barriers. So a lot of people have seen the Tiger Dam product. There's many others like that, that, like the hospital in Tampa that they had one, I don't remember the name of it, but that mitigated 8 feet of water and was critical. So there's options. There's more and more options every day.
I was going to mention, I was just going to mention the when the Tampa had deployed around the hospital, the dams. Adrian, do you want to mention too, real quick, some of the like repetitive loss properties and the options there, and the eventual goal within ARCLY is to potentially join some of those programs or some of those resources up and make them available on your website.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, with repetitive loss and, if you're talking about repetitive loss, then you're talking about FMA, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, which is for NFIP policyholders that have repetitive losses. And, typically the money is used either to elevate or to acquire and demolish that building and make it so that it is not developed in the future. And what I usually see is about a 50-50 split when you talk to communities that are elevating. Some buildings are worth preserving and elevating, and the homeowner has an attachment and they want to make that investment and go through the hassle. And other buildings are simply not worth the trouble, and it's better to just demolish them. So that's that. And then on ArcLead, the idea is to, it's a data-driven platform. So we know that flood insurance is probably the best option for the majority of people. And then there's attainable flood mitigation products that are a great thing for many people to have. But elevating is something that, we really want to promote as well. And we want to integrate the contractors directly onto the platform so that people can, the contractors, the grants, the financing, the whole, one-stop shop type thing, where you can say, hey, I want to elevate my house, and you click the button. And depending on where you live, it'll connect you to your local resources, whether it's your floodplain manager, who is maybe they're actively going after funding to elevate homes. Really, whatever it is that it looks like, that's what we want to connect people to. It's just the whole suite of solutions.
That's fantastic. Another question we had, we recognize that we have been focusing on the flood and flood insurance. What about, we talk about a lot of flood insurance, but how do we acknowledge how are going to be the impacts of climate change on regular insurance costs?
So this one's for me too?
Yes, for Adrian, yes.
Okay. So not talking about homeowners here, or are we also talking about homeowners with this
I
question?
think we're talking about homeowners too, yes.
Yeah. So, something you hear a lot is, well, these companies are going to go out of business or pull out of the market. And we've seen that in California with homeowners. A lot of companies, dropped those policies right before there were a bunch of wildfires, and, a lot of people lost everything in California. So, the same is true in Florida. Homeowners insurance companies are struggling. They're going out of business, and, they're typically smaller, more domestic companies, whereas the flood insurance companies are usually MGAs, managing general agents, that are basically, they don't usually carry the risk on their own books. They are basically distribution partners for the large reinsurance companies like Swiss Re and Munich Re. And when you talk to these companies, they kind of look at flood risk. That part of their portfolio is kind of like, um, the part that they want to sweep under a rug, and not, it's kind of like a small dirty part of their portfolio. They don't like it, but they have it. It's there. Um, to the tune of like $5 or $6 billion, which is small numbers to them. So these companies are not going to go out of business. They're out there helping the reinsurance companies, provide this kind of coverage and get into the market. And what we're actually seeing is that, the National Flood Insurance Program did what it set out to do pretty well for decades. And then with Katrina and some of those major storms started having major losses. So the program has lost over $40 billion, of which half was pardoned. So they still owe the Treasury another $20 billion. So they're hurting, and they are always looking for new creative ways to recoup that money. And, they kind of rebrand their underwriting every once in a while. So Risk Rating 2.0 was the most recent rebranding and restructuring, with the ultimate goal being, you know, um, to recoup a lot of that money, which they owe us. So that program is hurting, and the prices are going up, and they're going to continue going up. So many policies are very subsidized, and they are now on what's called a glide path to full actuarial rates. So the prices are going to go up for everyone, pretty much, in the long term. And that has actually given the private market an opportunity to get back in the game, because they could not be in the game back in the day when there was no good data. Now they have incredible data to work with, and they can spread their risk a lot more effectively and can beat the NFIP on price the vast majority of the time. There's over 30 private carriers that are A-rated that are offering policies, and there's always one willing to underprice the NFIP heavily. So this is something that most floodplain managers are not aware of, that there's actually a pretty healthy private market out there. And, in the case of my grandfather, just to throw out some real numbers, the lowest NFIP policies in his neighborhood were 1,100. When we pulled quotes, the NFIP came back at 4,200 for him at a unsubsidized rate, because when you're buying a new policy, it's no longer subsidized. It's when you're grandfathered in that you keep those rates. So it was 4,200 for a NFIP policy. It was 1,600 for the cheapest private market policy. And then it ended up being, it got raised to 2,500 when it renewed. But you can always just shop around again or go to the NFIP if that's your only option or the cheapest option. So I don't even know if I answered the question, but you got me rambling about insurance. If anyone has any more specific insurance questions, I'm happy to talk about them if we have time.
Yeah, I think we all like ramble about insurance. It's definitely not very open. But let's move to Jennifer because we're running short of time. Any other new steps on the collaborative, Jennifer?
Well, I think, figuring out with all of these data sets that we can now employ as we're stepping forward, it's really starting to engage and understand, working especially with insurance companies and those reinsurance companies that Adrian just mentioned. How can we start accounting for these mitigation or adaptation activities that are occurring around the region? Are there opportunities to work with the insurance industry with their data sets, with our new data sets, and figuratively show them the investment that's happened and the change in some of the risk as it gets redone annually or updated annually? What could that illustrate? And then also we'd like to figure out a way to do some scenario planning where if a new development were to come in or a mitigation project were to be illustrated, how does that change within the risk assessment model and what we're able to show with those data sets? So some of those, that's just some of the internal things that we're thinking about. Each one of our partners in the collaborative and as well as our counties and a lot of our cities are just now starting to utilize the data sets and apply some of the tools that we have provided and are starting to turn in projects. So the city of Cocoa has partnered with us on writing their THIRA. So we have run it through the tool. We've gotten that 50-page report. We are comparing it to all of the requirements, and then that will be the first one that we officially will turn in and hopefully will get accepted. Osceola County is looking also to employ it. I think they are looking at their LMS, an update of their LMS. So the tool is going to provide that information and data specifically to update their LMS. And there's other areas around our region that are going to employ it. And from that, now that once that gets QA, QC, then we can really start thinking, okay, what are some other opportunities for us? With regards to the collaborative, the larger group and what I continuously hear, not just from the steering committee, but from the elected leaders and our partners, is they want to start doing implementation projects. So taking those ideas, we've operationalized them in several different departments within given jurisdictions. And now how do we bring in capital to implement the projects and start really building some mitigation or adaptation projects? City of Cape Canaveral has been incredibly successful. They've implemented a rain garden after conducting a vulnerability assessment and tons of subsequent work, and it's showing significant amounts of success and results in keeping the flooding away from the community. I would encourage you all to call the City of Cape Canaveral, Zach Eichholz, and we want to continue to see things like that across the region. So that's what we're hoping for next steps. I'd love to see if any of you folks have any ideas, please give us a call. I'll put our information up there. That's Adrian or I, and we're happy to, figure out what some next steps could be and then look for capital to bring in to fund the project.
Before we leave, and these two questions came out kind of like the end, so I want to honor all the people that have stayed with us. So one of the people is asking me how are communities limiting or guiding development in floodplains, whether it's policy or regulatory one. I don't know if any of you want to speak to that.
I mean, there are, building codes. So if you have a floodplain and you want to develop within the floodplain, then you're going to have to, comply with those building codes. I think the more interesting one is kind of the substantial damage, substantial improvement question, right? Because the way that works is if your building is not up to code and there are damages worth 50% or more, or improvements worth 50% or more, then you are required to bring that building up to code, which, if it needs to be elevated, is a very, very expensive thing to do. It puts a big burden on property owners, and it makes floodplain managers' lives very very tricky, because they have to enforce this, and it doesn't make them very popular with their communities, and it doesn't make them popular with the state either. So now we have Senate Bill 180, which is wants to limit what communities can do and enforce when they want to have more strict standards. So, that's friction that you're going to see kind of everywhere. But I mean, the more that you can prevent development in your floodplain, the better.
Yeah,
Like, it's just
agreed. I'll say, Louise, in our region, we have seen multiple cities, especially after Ian and Nicole, from the day as some city or county managers really starting to talk about eminent domain for the first time. We've seen moratoriums on the news from a bunch of different jurisdictions on new development happening until they get their arms around like what flooding is happening and why it's flooding happening in particular areas. And there are areas also in our region that have identified, and this is already in policy up in Norfolk, Virginia, they've identified areas within their county where they will no longer invest in the infrastructure because of the amount of flooding that it's happening now and they anticipate to happen within the next 10 years. So there's examples across the country where it's kind of this active retreat or managed retreat, if you will. And I think more and more local governments are really going to have to start considering whether a new development in a flood-prone area, whether they're going to want to accept the infrastructure that's going to be having to be managed over the long term, whether they're going to be willing to do that with are they going to assume that risk?
Fantastic. So Jennifer, I think this is for you. It's like, how do you plan to ensure that the ongoing engagement with stakeholders across the different jurisdictions will continue as you implement these resiliency strategies?
Oh my gosh, I feel like we have meetings all the time. So on the RPC website, you can go and sign up for any one of the committees that are established. We generally have meetings generally from like November to the summer. Lots of people go away in the summer. You can email me if you want to get engaged. So there's continual engagement happening. And as much as any jurisdiction wants to be engaged, we are proud and happy to do work with you. We're only one department within the larger planning council. As Luis mentioned in the beginning, each of us are working to operationalize a lot of resilience into our work. So a lot of the data and the work that we have done or come out of the collaborative is being operationalized. Luis has done it in his work within the economic development realm. It certainly happens within our planning projects and programs. So reach out to us, call us, and we're happy to engage and help you get more involved.
No, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Adrian. I think we reached the end of the webinar. Before this, I would like to invite you to follow up for the next series. We're going to be meeting July 17 to talk a little more about community vulnerability assessments. August 21st, we will have a food systems or urban planning. And our final webinar for this session is on September 18, and it will be about the Regional Integrated Climate Action Plan. For those of you who are not doing it already, you can also follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news and Facebook too, to get the latest news about what's happening with the council. We will be meeting next week at the city of Apopka with our friends from the Florida Brownfields Association for Community Day. So we certainly invite all of you. More information is our LinkedIn website. But again, I would like to thank all of you for joining in and just wish you to have a wonderful evening. Bye.